Hello, everyone, and welcome to this joint seminar. It's conducted by the Science and Society Network in conjunction with the Critical Digital Infrastructures and Interfaces Group. We have a tradition in Australia of offering a welcome to country. I'd like to do so by today first starting and paying my respects to the people of the Kulin Nation, the lands on which I'm speaking to you from today, and pay my respects to the elders past, present, and those emerging. And thank you all for joining us today. I'm really excited to have the speakers of terrific book Controversy Mapping to join us today. And by way of overview, I'd like to say it's a brilliant read. Please do have a look. It explores the socio-technological debates, describing them visually and in writing, which for me is just a joy to see and read. It discusses the history of controversy analysis in science and technology studies, actor network theory and digital methods, providing conceptual and practical instructions on how to investigate them with tools at the crossroad of ethnography, semiotics, network analysis, and digital fieldwork. I'm pleased to introduce the authors. Tommaso Venturini is an associate professor at the médialab of the University of Geneva, a researcher at the CNRS Centre for Internet and Society, and a founding member of the Public Data Lab. In 2017 and 18, he was a researcher at the École Normale Supérieure of Lyon and recipient of the Advanced Research Fellowship of the French Institute of Computer Science and Automation. His research is positioned at the interface between social and human sciences and digital computation and design. His investigations on digital methods, digital media studies, controversy mapping, science and technology studies, and more, particularly on the attention economy. Anders Kristian Munk is also associate professor at the Techno-Anthropology Lab and scientific director of MASSHINE. He does research on controversies over new science and technology, for example, in relation to artificial intelligence or green transitions. He's been particularly engaged in the development of new digital methods at the interface between data science and anthropology. He is currently interested in the establishment of a methods program for computational anthropology, particularly in light of recent developments in machine learning and generative AI. We're joined by our discussant, Alan Jones. He's the General Manager of Deakin's Artificial Intelligence, Applied Artificial Intelligence Institute, A²I². He has 15 years' experience across defence, education, employment, transport, health, aged care, arts and culture. Alan's current research and work focus around harnessing the emerging capabilities of generative AI towards building ecosystems of intelligence that maximise the potential of human-machine collaboration in better serving the needs of our communities. Thanks each for joining us today. I'd like to throw now to Tommaso and Anders to lead us in their overview of their terrific book, Controversy Mapping. After that, we'll be joined by Alan as a discussant, and then we'll open the floor to questions. Thank you both.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here with you today, even though we are, we're not actually there. But it's great to have the possibility to present this book, which has been a lot of, hard work for me and others. And it's always, it's always a pleasure to present it and to discuss it with the brilliant young scholars such as you. So we'll introduce the book briefly. In a very simple way. We'll just go through the table of contents and show you a little bit of what each chapter looks like and what it contains. So basically give you an overview of the book, a very we'll not get into sexual debate, we just tell you the contents of the book. We'll try to be quick with this, so we have more time to discuss and get your question, because I think that's where the most interesting bit is. So I'll start and then I'll give the floor to Anders. So let me show my presentation so you can see a few pictures of the book. So this is the cover of the book, and this is the table of contents. So As you can see, the book is basically divided in three main parts. So part one, which is about the features of controversial landscape. So what kind of elements, objects, actors, subjects you can find in a controversy. We'll talk about that. Part two is about the tools of social controversy. So basically the instruments that we can use to observe and then describe those features. And then part three, which is very important to us, is the politics of mapping. So how you go about not only technically, but also from a political point of view when you do controversy mapping. So the book is also, and it's probably the two best parts of it, is also preceded by a preface by Richard Roger, which I really recommend to read. It's a very good read, and it makes something that is really interesting. It tells the story of digital methods, and now from the beginning, something that actually we also kind of discovered. We knew, but we didn't know that it was so strong, that the link between controversy mapping and digital methods was so strong. And Richard tells in this preface how from the very beginning, the whole program of developing methods to reuse the resources made available by social media and online media to study society was very much inspired by actor network theory and controversy mapping. So this link that we wanted to make explicit in the book between actor network theory, so this theory that comes from STS and has been developed by Bruno Latour, Michel Calon, and John Lowe, and digital methods, which is this set of methods and tools that have been developed, by Richard Roger, Noor Chamares, and other people, and in the UK and in the Netherlands and in France and in Copenhagen in Denmark, existed from the very beginning. And Richard tells this story very, very nicely. And then the book is concluded by an interview with Bruno Latour, which is also very, very interesting. As you certainly know, Bruno Latour has been the mentor for me and others. He's really, it's kind of his voice is running through the book. I think it's cited hundreds of times through the book. He's the person who is one of the founder of STS, actor network theory, and controversy mapping. And it has been a great inspiration to us. And this interview is very interesting, I think, because it comes back to controversy mapping at the moment when we were in the sort of the peak of the concern or about fake news. And so, and the peak of the concern for the loss of authority of established science. And suddenly, so all the discussion is about, how do you do controversy mapping while not undermining the authority of science? Something that is kind of a reversal. We might talk about that in what, sort of the objective of controversy mapping. The book is also, it's made even better, I think, by the images. So there's a lot. Well, it's a book about mapping. Of course, there's a lot of lots of images and charts and diagrams, and there are 90 of them, and they're all being redesigned by this fantastic Italian designer called Federica Bardelli, who took a lot of what we get, photos, pictures, and redesigned all of them in a beautiful way that really, I think, really tie together the whole book, and as well as sort of presenting example on how you visually map controversy. As most books, it starts with an introduction, which I think might be interesting because it contains a full example of controversy mapping. So this was something that we were not sure that we would include in the beginning, but then the reviewer and the publisher really asked us to put that in. I think in the end we are very happy we did that, because then we take one controversy and we really unfold it from start to end. Interestingly, we choose not to tell one of the controversy we studied. There's many of such examples in the book, but here in the introduction, we basically remapped visually and also in words a controversy that had been studied by Charles Thompson about elephants in the Amboseli Park in Africa. And it's a very short version of a controversy mapping, but it really, I think it's nice for students as well, because it gives you in 15, 20 pages an idea of what actually is, like in practice, to map a controversy. And the other reason why I think this example is interesting is that it's a non-digital one. So in the rest of the book, all the examples that are given are based on digital methods. So we present how to use these methods and sort of digital data to sort of as a springboard to map a controversy. But here we wanted to show that it's also possible, perfectly possible, to map a controversy just using qualitative data and qualitative methods. And so we start from this qualitative analysis by Charles Thompson, and we unfold it in the introduction. And then the book goes on to the part one, which is the features of the controversial landscape. And the first type of features that we consider are not really a feature, but it's really like a more meta question, which is why should one in the first place engage with mapping controversy? And we actually try also to give a bunch of reasons why you should not do it, or rather, why doing it sort of exposes you to all sorts of risks. And as you can see in the slide, so when Anders was mapping this windmill controversy in Denmark, it was like unexpectedly, but it's kind of surprised that happens all the time in controversy mapping. He used to be a spy, and I don't think you can see I'm not sure you can see it in the picture right here, but there were like even sort of Nazi iconography associated to this mapping example, because it was as if, and of course that was not the case, but people accused Anders and his colleagues to kind of really like be the NSA spying citizen and activist in the Denmark. So things push back when you do controversy mapping, and I think it's part of the interest of it and also the fun of it to some extent. But you should be aware of this, and as we try to explain, accept complicity. So there's no way you can really be. I mean, you can be neutral, but then what you do will be reappropriated. No matter what you do and how you do it, it will be reappropriated by the actors in the controversy. And that's why also, and we come back to that, the politics of controversy mapping is so important. The second chapter is about issues. So the subject, the questions, the matters of concern, to use a word that comes from Bruno Latour, that in which a controversy can be decomposed. So controversies are always extremely complicated. They're never binary, but they're never just about one single question. They're always about a bunch of questions that kind of interact and interfere in, again, it's kind of unexpected and weird ways, one with another. And so the first thing you should do as a controversy mappers is to do your best to decompose the controversy, to sort of cut it down to all these different subjects and questions, but also show how these different subjects and questions are connecting one another, and how none of them can be treated in isolation, but all of them should be really seen in their interferences. The third chapter is about the actors of controversy. So this is also very important, because as soon as you enter the sort of, again, the weird world of sociotechnical controversy, you suddenly became aware that there is much more out there than we tend to think about normally. There are more actors, and not only there are more actors, but these actors are more diverse than what one would expect. And so, as you probably know, a big, huge, important part of ethno theory is that society is made not only by human actors, of course they play a very important role, but also by all sorts of non-human actors. So, technical objects, artifacts of all sorts, scientific theories, natural beings, but also collective objects such as, groups, institutions, laws. All these things play a role in a controversy, and they play really an active role. They're not just some factor in the context of the controversy. They're really in the controversy, acting, and they're acting in the same way in which, like, or in similar way, or in a way that should be considered together with how human actor works. And only when you consider all this diversity of actors, then you can really understand why a controversy unfolds in one direction or in another direction, or why its dynamic change through time. And I'm here giving the floor to Anders for the second part of the book.
Thank you, Tommaso. And we agreed that I will just say change slide whenever we get to that. So we'll feel old school Diaz style in the classroom. So we're now at the second part of the book, which, as Tommaso said, was about the tools of social cartography. So controversy mapping began as a very practical quest, if you want. So it actually developed in classrooms where actor network theorists, rather than teaching sort of theoretical course introduction to STS, had engineers simply try to map a controversy around a technology they were interested in. So it has a very practical and methodological origin, and therefore the middle section of the book is focused on the tools that are in the cartographer's toolbox. And they are primarily digital, except for the first chapter. And I think we can move to that now, Tommaso. So in the first chapter, we kind of go back actually. So there is one more place where it's mainly controversy mapping using tried and tested qualitative methods. So we go back to saying, well, there is an origin in controversy mapping in actor network theory, where you could possibly even say that actor network theory is a form of controversy analysis, in the sense that it is easiest to follow the actors when something is contested and they have to make their positions clear and so forth. And so we use an example here of a contested new appellation in the French winemaking industry, and show how you can use tried and tested tools from narratology and grimace and these kind of things to describe the controversy in an actor network theoretical language. This, of course, draws heavily on ethnographic methods, so interviewing actors, going there to do participant observation, taking notes, and not doing data visualizations, but drawing diagrams, which is, if you read the actor network theoretical literature of the 80s, you will see a lot of maps that are really sort of diagrams at the end of the analysis, rather than data visualizations that are at the beginning of the analysis and allows you to explore the terrain. So I think we can move on now. Yep. So now we're at the next chapter is about digital methods in general. So we are at the junction around 2000 when Richard Rogers, as Tommaso talked about before, came into contact with Bruno Latour, and especially around a PhD student together, Nortje Maris, who's now one of the leading professors in this field. And of course, also the birth of Web 2.0 at that moment, which allowed them to think maybe there was a way to use online data to trace controversies. And so we talk about first more of the sort of the methodological issues of considering digital traces to be traces of actor activity in a controversy. I believe that for the vignette for this case is using search data from Google to study how different countries are interested in issues during the COVID pandemic. But we dive into some of the basic questions of online grounding and how to represent concerns based on some trace from a platform, and therefore also having to study how platforms mediate that signal and so forth. Yeah, we can move on tomorrow. So the after that comes a more practical chapter where we I guess this is the most practical the book gets. So this is about how you build a data set online, basically, So we get into techniques like scraping, crawling, using an application programming interface. I guess this might also be one of the areas where the book is already fairly outdated in the sense that the application programming interfaces are rapidly becoming inaccessible on many platforms. And so there are, lots of method innovation needed here. But we use an example of something that can still be done fairly well, namely Wikipedia. So discuss different potentials in using web scraping or going through the API, but also using a qualitative sensibility of where the interesting part, the middle layer of the web is. So trying to avoid big platforms which are always referenced and so forth, but trying to find the juicy bits of the controversy that shows us differences in how actors organize and so forth. We can move on. So a key part, I guess it's a standing joke, both within and outside the controversy mapping community, is that it always begins and ends a network. And of course, there could be many reasons for that. I guess one of them is that this came from actor network theory, which has also a concept of network in it, of course, but it's a different kind of network metaphor. So there are different networks at play here. Of course, you study online phenomena, online platforms, which are often network data. You do it with an actor network theoretical sensibility, which has this idea that actors are networks and vice versa. But in that case, networks are a process that gives you agency. And then you also represent some of the phenomena using what's called visual network analysis. You see some examples here on the right. And one of our good colleagues, Mathieu Giacomi, was a developer of a software platform, Gephi, that has been widely used both in the digital methods community in general and for controversy mapping, where the idea is that you can explore digital traces in a network format that allows you to discover questions such as why are these actors organized together, or why are these issues always mentioned in the same context and so forth, or why is this actor so central? So it becomes a critical tool for what we call exploratory data analysis. And we argue in this chapter that this is particularly important in controversy mapping when you want to stay agnostic and open at the beginning of your research about who the actors could be, what they could consider to be relevant issues, and how that might have changed over time. Yes, let's move on. So this was the most practical part of the book. Then we get into the last part that, as Tommaso said, is quite dear to our heart. We call it the politics of map making. You could also say that it is about the effects that controversy mapping inevitably has in the world it is studying. So Tommaso began by saying that there's no way to avoid complicity as a map maker, even if you produce a neutral map, or what you perceive to be a neutral map of a controversy. Even if that was possible, then it is in some actors' interests to have the controversy staged as controversial, while it is in other actors' interest to claim that it is not controversial at all. This is something we see in almost all discussions. And so there really is no way of entering the territory of controversy as a cartographer without becoming somehow complicit in the development of that debate. And this requires reflection on why you're doing it, with whom, and so forth. And we first deal with that question as a question of representation. So we draw here, for example, on discussions from critical geography. So there's been loads of discussions, of course, in geography about the consequences of making geographical maps. So we discuss how they can inform our practice as controversy mappers. And we also give pointers on how you can try and build not just maps, but atlases of controversies that always try to offer different viewpoints. So every map is a reduction. And you can say as you moved from qualitative case studies of controversies in actor network theory in the 80s to this ambition of doing actual visualizations of the debate, you also introduce an obstacle to yourself, because every time you have to visualize something in 2 dimensions, you have to choose what to put in that visualization and what not to put. And so this adds to your complicity, because your choices of visualization are in themselves partisan moves. So how can you make sure that you offer different viewpoints? This is discussed in this chapter. We can move on, I think. And then we, in the last chapter here, we discuss how we can think of what we do as a form of intervention. So I guess one of the stories here is that in the controversy mapping community, there has been sort of shifting ideas about how you become relevant to the actors. In one of the early projects called Marcus Paul, which tested the use of digital methods for controversy mapping, the idea was that you would develop controversy mapping tools that would then be given to actors in controversies. It could be journalists or activists or representatives of NGOs, who would then use that to map the controversy themselves. This turned out to be quite a difficult way to engage. Journalists do not have the time to do that. And in the next project, the EMAPS, next big European project, the approach was taken that we would hire data designers to do almost perfect maps that could then be brought to the stakeholders in the controversy, who would use them to navigate the discussion. This turned out to also fail at creating engagement, and so we developed this idea of a data sprint where you invite stakeholders to do kind of participatory design on the maps with you. And I guess this is where most of the controversy mapping community finds itself today, trying to work with or invite different stakeholders from a controversy, different actors from a controversy, to help co-create a controversy atlas with you. So that's another way of embedding yourself or deliberately dealing with your complicity in the discussion. I don't know, Thomas, do you want to take over for the sort of the ending? I think that would be nice, book ending it in both ends.
Yeah, with pleasure. Yeah. So yeah, the book end is this chapter that we moved around a lot. It used to be the first chapter of the book, and now is the last one. I think the whole book has been rewritten many times, maybe too many times, but this particular chapter has been rewritten even more than the others, and it tries, maybe in a sense, take a step back from the practical discussion, not a step back from the political discussion of controversy mapping, rather kind of a step into the politics of controversy mapping, but a step back from the more practical tool-based discussion to reflect on sort of how controversy mapping fits in the ecological environmental crisis in which we are living right now. So the title is Controversy Mapping in the Shadow of Gaia. Gaia, as you know, is another name for our planet. And then it was very dear to Bruno Latour. And so we really try to think about how this method that we have presented through the book can contribute to, of course, not solving, because controversy mapping is never about solving anything, but at least making sense of the situation in which we live, and this kind of weird phenomenon that we are faced with, which is at the same time our worlds seem very small, because everything is connected to everything else, and there's no way we can act in any way without sort of disturbing some ecological or social equilibrium, either close to us or far away, but still close to us in its consequences and connections. And at the same time, our world is very huge, because exactly what whatever we do have impacts that are global and extremely large scale. So how do we conceive and think about this this kind of tension in which we live, and also how do we act about it using the conceptual and political tools that are offered by controversy mapping, STS, and digital math. And this conclude the books before the interview to Bruno Latour.
Thank you both. I'd like to invite Alan, comments?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, thanks so much for covering the book in its entirety. Some really exciting and interesting stuff in there. I haven't had a chance to read through it fully myself, but yeah, really look forward to. So yeah, I suppose like the first thing that came to mind was have you applied controversy mapping to the publishing of controversy mapping itself? Because you're sort of touching on the idea that mapping out the controversy has certain political effects that go along with it. So where does your book fit within them?
Sorry, I don't know if I understood, but because you moved the computer while you were asking the question at the point where you connected to, and I lost. I don't know if Anders, if you got it. Okay, if you do, I know you same problem here.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yep.
Yep. Yeah, I was wondering whether you'd applied controversy mapping to the publishing of your book, because obviously, being aware of a controversy map and the process of mapping things out, as you said, has certain political ramifications that go with it. Is that something you've considered?
I think the book did not steer controversy itself, which I think it was, to some extent, it was is not unexpected and it's not surprising, because the book is not an exercise in controversy mapping itself. It relays a lot of such exercise, but they tend to be like old. There tend to be old controversies that we map there. We see that most of them are kind of resolved, or maybe if not resolved, people have moved on, and now they're not odd controversy. So the book has not created such controversy that we could tell, but it did happen in our own work. And I think the example that I gave you before, maybe Anders can give you, can tell you a bit more. A lot of the mapping that we have done, and particularly Anders have done, because Anders is so much more controversial than I am, and factful, of course. Those things have sort of nourished the controversy and have been mapped reflexively. But Anders, maybe you want to tell more about this.
Yeah, I mean, I guess one of the fundamental tenets we try to communicate about controversy mapping in the book is that you follow the actors, right? So someone has to contest something, and also to do it in particular ways. We kind of argue that it's not just sort of simple disagreements don't really qualify as controversies. There has to be a reason to map them, such as ontological multiplicity and people having different ideas about what is even at stake here. It has to be worth it. And so I'm actually I've never thought about the question you just asked. And now that you ask it, I'm sort of a bit sad that we didn't very more debate. It wasn't worth mapping, because or maybe I missed it, but I'm pretty sure that it didn't generate that kind of reaction. Of course, there are examples earlier. I mean, so actor network theory, particularly during the science wars, for example, has been hugely controversial. And so I think some of the points made in the book has at earlier points in time stirred controversy that could be mapped. And as Tommaso said, I think many people who have done controversy mapping have experienced quite hefty pushback from certain actor groups once they did that, right? So The wind turbine example we give in the book came from a strategic. I was doing controversy mapping on a strategic research project in Denmark, and I guess if you have the same definition of strategic research in Australia as we do, that means that the politicians have decided what the research agenda should be. So in this case, the project was about how can we, advance the green transition by increasing the amount of wind energy we produce in Denmark. And the controversy mapping here was to say, well, so the hypothesis of the project was, well, you need to do more participatory processes around wind turbine planning, and also in order to make sure that you get more stakeholders on board. And to do that, we need to do controversy mapping first to figure out what are people's concerns and who are the different actors who contest stuff that we should try and include. I almost want to say, of course, this was taken by wind turbine critics or skeptics or opponents as being kind of, they are spying on us. They are mapping who we are so that they can more effectively put down our resistance, which I think there's just no way of distancing yourself completely from critique, because the state funds a research project that does this kind of mapping. And as we all know, once you have mapped someone, you can tax them, you can administer them. Yeah, that's kind of the point of cartography. On the other hand, interestingly, these opponents also showed the network visualizations as a kind of a rallying cry, saying, look how strong we are, look how well connected we are. Haha, I guess they shot themselves in the foot here by demonstrating once and for all how well connected we are as a group. So they also actually strategically appropriated our maps to make their own case. And I think this is just you have to accept that as a fact of social life or political life, that when you engage with these topics, this is what happens.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm curious, and I suppose in conjunction with that, whether there's like particular considerations around like democratizing access, or like maybe effects. I'm not sure if that's the right word, but with say like a small team, I'm presuming involved in actually mapping out controversies, and there like being inevitable elements of bias, whether there's like particular approaches you can take to like either managing the corrosive effects of that could come, or as sort of a downstream consideration for the people who are people constructs of any kind that are being mapped within the controversy map. And just thinking about like a small group of power holders essentially, that ties to the political impact factors that you mentioned.
We thought about that, and actually, right after the book, the next project that we set up, which has been a bit dormant in the last few years, unfortunately, but was really sort of planned in that direction. It was the Public Data Lab. So after this big project that Anders talked about, e-maps, and after the book, we wanted to sort of continue this experience, but going even more in this like, let's do controversy mapping in society with social actors, sort of not just in the academia to publish papers, but also like to do kind of activist work or work with activists, which is not exactly the same thing, but somewhere in between the two, which is also something that it's very it's very common in the digital methods community. So that's why we set up the Public Data Lab with Liliana Buneguru and Jonathan Gray at King's College, and a bunch of other colleagues, Anders Koed Madsen and many others all around Europe. And this network, which, as I said, has been a bit dormant in the last few years. Jonathan is still doing a lot of stuff, but it's also thought as an infrastructure, which is there to sort of pick up this occasion of doing kind of engage and reflexive digital methods, controversy mapping, actual network theory work.
I think this is also in the book. This is what we cover in that last chapter about controversy mapping as a form of intervention. So it draws very specifically on the participatory design tradition, on experiences from ethnography, like Jean Rouge, for example, doing video ethnography together with his informants, so editing video in the field, things like that. And I think we mentioned that we developed this approach called the data sprint, which is, in a sense, a format for doing what you suggest, controversy mapping with specific stakeholders, because the experience is that once the data has been harvested and crunched and the visualizations made, it's very hard for actors to have to comment on it, so they need to be involved upstream. In a sense, it's really ironic that this realization came so late to controversy mapping, because A&T was actually, back with when we shifted from public understanding of science to public engagement with science. Actor network theorists like Michel Calon were one of the first to suggest this need for upstream engagement. But somehow at the back offices of those people, the controversy mappers were running around and thinking that they could avoid it. This came 20 years too late to controversy mapping, but I think it's very much where it is right now.
Yeah, great. How are we going for time?
I've got some questions if I
Absolutely.
can. Thanks. Thank you again. We have some questions coming from our stream. In the context of innovation and its management, does controversy mapping as a methodology help in anticipating controversies, conspiracies, or conflicts in some way? Can you say who it's from? And that is from Havna, and I joined yours in also, Radhika, into that one, as well as we drawing from Bruno's early work, keen to distinguish between controversies and conspiracies. So the question is, can you plan for that?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think so. These are two different questions, so they should be answered separately. So the first one is about innovation studies and sort of anticipation of controversy. And I think I would say I'm curious to know what we never discussed this, but I'm curious to know what Anders would also answer. So maybe we both answer. But I think controversy map is not about anticipating things. So I think we actually say it in the book that it's really about mapping what's happening more than sort of trying to forecasting what might happen. Because I don't think in general the social sciences are very good at forecasting, because the social world is just so surprising and weird that it doesn't really work or make sense to try to anticipate things. But you can be reactive, right? So controversy mapping is about being reactive and mapping live what's happening. Is also, on the other hand, we also say do not map very controversies that are too old and cold and sort of died out, but map them while they happen. So it's more about like, capturing and describing early signals of controversy rather than anticipating. And the second question about conspiracies, here is a complicated thing, because I think you're thinking about conspiracy theory rather than conspiracies themselves. So because conspiracies, they're pretty rare. But they do exist, but they're they cannot be studied with controversy mapping, because conspiracy, they're sort of the real conspiracy. They are hidden by definition, right? So you can uncover them by journalistic inquiry, but it's not something the controversy mapping was more about public debate and sociotechnical debate. So it would not be about conspiracy. Conspiracy theories, on the other hand, which is people imagining conspiracy that do not really exist. They can be mapped with controversy mapping. In fact, conspiracy theory to some extent, or at least some, there are plenty of types of conspiracy theories, but some of them are a kind of form of delusional controversy mapping, right? Controversy theorists kind of do something that, sort of resemble. They do maps, by the way. The main iconography of the conspiracy theories is that the crazy wall with the red tapes and threads connecting dots. all around the map. So it's very much kind of like controversy mapping, except it just happened in the head of the person, and it doesn't, it doesn't do it doesn't do the actual work of like looking at what's actually going on. So to some extent, to sort of bring together the two questions, sort of anticipating controversy might actually risk to fall into conspiracy theory. And that's why also, we rather not encourage scholars to try to anticipate, but just to really observe the empirical dynamics that they can see in the world.
Thank you for unpacking the two questions there, Anders.
Yeah, I think I could add a little bit to that. So I think another way to say that is that controversy comes from a radically empiricist tradition, where it's descriptive, it's what's going on in the world. But in the context of innovation, and one of the arguments we actually make in the book is that a reason for one of the whys of why would you study controversy would be because controversies, when they are there, offer one of the best laboratories to see what happens to innovations, right? So it's the ultimate social stress test. So you might not be so lucky that there is controversy around your product or your service or whatever it is you're innovating, but there is a way to learn from how similar projects have been contested. What are the typical concerns that come up? How do a seemingly neutral technology all of a sudden prompt a social reaction from specific groups? And we actually make the case that controversies are a great lens, but one of the only occasions where you can really study that. And so rather than talking about forecasting, we sometimes talk about scoping. And one of the reasons for going into a controversy could be to scope, which are either, if you have sometimes you think that there is no controversy around whatever it is you're doing, but it's because you talk to the wrong people or look at the wrong places, right? So controversy mapping can also be a way of scoping is, where is discussion going on? Or maybe you think that it's a very simple problem. Essentially, it's just about this, which makes it manageable for you. But then you realize that over here you have actors who think it's about something completely different, and you don't really want to engage with that because it complicates the situation. So there's definitely a scoping potential, I think, for innovation here. And then I also just wanted to mention that on the sort of conspiracy theory discussion, that I think one of the most interesting parts of the final interview with Bruno Latour, which, as Tommaso said, took place at the peak of one of the peak moments of concern about disinformation. The peak moment was the day after the 2020 American election. So you have QAnon people being elected into Congress. And that comes through quite forcefully in that interview. I think Bruno says something to the effect of, we used to think that it was our job to remind an establishment that was too trusting of science and institutions that there are other social concerns out there. But maybe we're now in the opposite situation. So he sort of poses the question of whether can we repurpose controversy mapping to try and close down some of these discussions or reach settlement somehow. And we don't have an answer for that, but I think there is some darkness, or at least some concern palpable in that interview.
I'm curious, as a follow-on with your notion of scoping with the communities and co-collaborating with a number for controversy mapping and various stakeholders. Has anything interesting turned up in that process?
Well, yes, lots of things have turned up. Lots of interesting things have turned up. I think particularly at least the thing that I find always the most interesting is that you kind of realize how what we call public opinion, or the public or citizens, or sort of the engaged part of that public opinion is much more like subtle, aware, and kind of very well capable to make sense of what's going on. So this also speaks to the question about fake news and conspiracies and this kind of thing. I think there is a tendency to underestimate citizens, and of course, we do in the book we cite many times Walter Lippmann, who's kind of pessimist about what citizen can do in political and public life, and we side with Lippmann, but with this tiny but important difference that we very well, by having working with them, recognize that there's a small portion of the public opinion which is not separated from it, but it's a portion which is engaged in the controversy, engaged in the debate, engaged in whatever questions we are discussing, and those people are very much aware, and sometimes like they're really sort of sophisticated social scientists, to some extent, sort of more they were. So there's an ethical, so as Anders was saying, there's an ethical reason to connect with the actors in the controversy and the people that are interested in it. But there's also like a very practical interest in that, because those people are often, as good and sometimes better than us in the academia. They have spent more time with the controversy. They know it from a more intimate place. They have developed tools. They have collected data. So it's really, this idea that, the scholar would arrive in the field and organize the informants that are, a bit naive and they don't know how to deal with the situation they're in. That's completely false, right? That's not at all what happens. Most of the time you arrive, people are already doing all sorts of mapping, all sorts of researching, all sorts of investigation, and you just have to find a way to fit in, which is complicated, but also like extremely interesting.
Thank you. We have a question from Russell Teitler, and he asks, we have constructed controversy maps with teachers and students. Are there any principles that you would suggest that would help frame a controversy to allow productive mapping over a short time frame?
This is something we deal with in the book, actually, Tomas. So I think this was one of the first things that were written for the book, possibly. So the whole book began with Tommaso's teaching materials for this course, and one of the best slides Tommaso has is the how do you choose a controversy that can actually be mapped in a time frame and with the resources you have available. Of course, this is a very necessary slide when you have students available for a course and they have to do it. So we have I can't remember which figure it is, but there is this. We have different scales, such as it's easier to map a controversy that is public rather than one that is behind closed doors. It is boring to map a two-binary controversy, but if it's too ontologically complex, maybe it's not for you as a one person on a 5 TS course. Controversies that are hot are easier to map than controversies that are cold. So yes, we could go back to earlier controversies because they're in the archives, but it's much easier when you know the context in which to interpret certain statements and so forth. So am I forgetting something here, Tommaso? It's your slide, but that's actually something that is dealt with pretty extensively in the book.
No, I think you're more or less touched on, and it's actually easier. The one thing maybe we forgot to discuss is it's actually easier to study scientific and technical controversies rather than commonplace ones, because people are using just a more technical and so therefore more specific language, which avoids a lot of ambiguity, homonymities, and people using the same words but actually talking about different things, which also happen, of course, in technical and scientific controversy. But to some extent, you can sort of piggyback on the traceability on science and technology.
But maybe you could also add maybe that there is things are happening at the moment which kind of shift some of these resource concerns. So, for example, in my lab, we're working on a large national project to understand discussions around algorithms and data in a democratic context, and we have a very large scientific corpus, over 1 million scientific papers about machine learning and algorithms. We harvested that in 2021 and spent half a year qualitatively annotating this big, beautiful network visualization. And then generative AI happened, and it was completely obsolete, and no one wanted to read it. But funnily, the fact that generative AI happened means that we now do not have to spend half a year annotating, I think, 235 topical clusters. We can ask GPT-4 to help us write those annotations, which has turned out to open up a whole new possibilities in terms of what you can do in which kind of time. So things are happening in that arena as well.
I weep for your lost work, Anders. I'm sorry to hear that. We have another question. We're joined by Anders Grundtvig from University of Copenhagen, and as an early career scholar, their experience is that their maps are methodologically contested, which is great, but also frustrating because they would like to discuss the politics of mapping. Do you have any tips?
So I'm the co-supervisor of Anna, so I think Tomas.
There's a conflict of interest. You also have the same name, so maybe the same person. Is it a conspiracy? We'll never know about this conspiracy. No, it's a very good question, and to some extent, I think it's how can I say? I can answer that reflexively on controversy by using controversy mapping. So people most often people criticize methodology rather than sort of the more substantial political or scientific consequences or something, because it's easier to criticize and more effective to criticize a technical element rather than that more substantial point that a controversy map or controversy atlas is trying to make. But that is also something, I mean, a little bit as what Anders was saying before, we have to accept and live with that, because that is also what happens in controversy, right? So when people oppose windmills, as we discussed before, they might oppose windmills in general, but most of the time they understand that it's more effective. They say, well, I'm not against windmill in general, I guess about this windmill in my backyard, because there is this, rare bird who's flying by and it could be, disturbed by the mill. And of course, this kind of technical argument, to some extent, it's not that it hides a larger political thing, but it became part of it. That's no way one can sort of separate the two. So it is, I agree with Anders Grundtvig, it is really, it is annoying, right? That we are always, we often have to fight this methodological criticism rather than have the more interesting discussion that we would like. On the other hand, on the first, there's no way out of it. And second, it's a price we pay for innovating in methodology. So another thing that you might have understood in our presentation, what Anders was saying, is that controversy mapping is about trying out new stuff as methods goes. So there's a whole thing, we did not discuss it, but controversy mapping is also very much related to this thing we call qualitative methods, which is a very bad name because it gives the idea that it's kind of sort of a little bit of quantitative, a little bit qualitative methods, where actually I think we should call neither qualitative nor quantitative methods, or now I call them like non-binary methods, which is methods that are different from the traditional one. But of course, because they are different and new, they are, they're apt for being criticized.
Thank you for that. We're almost at time. I'll just ask for one final comment from Alan, our discussor, and invite you to come.
Absolutely.
Won't touch the computer.
Firstly, thanks for a super engaging discussion and a really great coverage of some important topics around this work. Personally, I'm super excited to see what generative AI opens up for you guys in what you're talking about, which is about like progressing the outcomes of this work, rather than sort of being too questioned of the methodology of things. So probably a long and winding separate discussion, but hopefully at some stage we circle back around, and there's a world in which generative AI is weaved really nicely into this work.
And my thanks too, on behalf of the Science and Society Network, Radhika Guror, and my co-lead on the data culture groups and co-lead on the critical digital infrastructures and interfaces group, Leap Keemsberg, and Leonard Hoon. Thank you very much for your help in planning this. And my deep thanks to Anders and Tommaso for bringing the work that you're doing to life. It was wonderful to hear and hear you speak so passionately about your work, and really engaging. So thank you so much, and wish you were here that we could carry on these discussions.
Thanks for all your great comments.
Look forward to hopefully connecting in the future.
We definitely will. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks so
so
much.
Okay, the stream has ended and we're still on the Zoom.